There comes a moment in the life of the soul when the familiar ground beneath your feet begins to shift, imperceptibly at first, like the subtle tremor that precedes an earthquake. You may not recognize it immediately, this sacred disturbance. That signals the beginning of your great unraveling. It arrives not with thunder or lightning, but with the quiet persistence of water finding its way through stone, dissolving the very foundations upon which you have built your understanding of self and world. The comfortable illusions that once cradled your days begin to lose their power to soothe. Those automatic responses, those unquestioned beliefs, those inherited ways of seeing, they start to feel foreign in your mouth, like words from a language you're slowly forgetting. You find yourself standing at the threshold between two distinct territories of being, the familiar landscape of unconscious participation in the collective dream, and another realm entirely one, that whispers to you of truths so profound they threaten to reshape everything you thought you knew about existence itself. This is no ordinary transition. This is the soul's descent into its own depths, a journey that Jung understood as both necessary and perilous. The persona, that carefully constructed mask we wear to navigate the social world, begins to crack under the weight of authentic seeing. Each fracture lets in light from dimensions of reality you had not known existed. And with that light comes a terrible beauty that both illuminates and burns. You may find yourself looking in the mirror and recognizing a stranger, not because your physical features have changed, but because the eyes looking back carry a quality of awareness that was not there before. These are the eyes of one who has begun to see through the veil of Maya, the collective trance that keeps most of humanity sleepwalking through their days. And once this seeing begins, there is no unseeing, no return to the blessed ignorance of unconscious living. The initiation into high-up consciousness is not marked by external ceremony or ritual, though it is no less sacred for its subtlety. It begins with the quiet recognition that something fundamental has shifted in the very ground of your being. Perhaps it starts with a moment of inexplicable clarity in the midst of ordinary conversation, when you suddenly perceive the mechanical nature of social interaction, the way words are exchanged without meaning, the way people speak past each other from behind their respective masks. Or perhaps it manifests as a growing discomfort with activities and pursuits that once brought satisfaction, as if you have outgrown a favorite childhood game and can no longer pretend to find it engaging. This is the beginning of what the alchemists called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. For it is indeed against our natural human tendency to remain in the comfortable embrace of the collective unconscious, to continue participating in the shared delusions that bind communities together in their familiar patterns of sleeping and dreaming. To awaken from this dream is to risk isolation, to risk being seen as strange or difficult, to risk losing the easy belonging that comes with unconscious participation in the collective trance. Yet the soul, once stirred to consciousness, will not be denied its journey toward wholeness. Like a plant turning inevitably toward light, something deep within you orients itself toward truth, regardless of the cost. You begin to notice the gap between what people say and what they mean, between the face they show the world and the reality they harbor in their private moments. This is not cynicism being born, but discernment, the capacity to see clearly without the filters of wishful thinking or collective conditioning. The great unraveling has begun, and there is both terror and liberation in this recognition. Terror, because the familiar world is dissolving before your eyes, revealing itself to have been far more fragile and constructed than you ever imagined. Liberation, because something authentic is finally being born from the ashes of your false certainties. Something that has always been there, waiting to emerge, but could not do. So while you remained identified with the limited perspective of your conditioned self, this is the sacred wound of awakening, the necessary destruction that precedes all authentic creation, the symbolic death that must occur before the true self can be born. Your eyes open to the shadow, both personal and collective, that permeates every aspect of human existence, like a dark thread woven through the fabric of reality itself. This recognition arrives not as a cynical disillusionment, but as a profound awakening to the completeness of the human condition. The understanding that light and darkness are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a greater wholeness that includes everything and excludes nothing. You begin to see through the spiritual materialism that disguises ego inflation as enlightenment, recognizing how the very pursuit of consciousness can become another form of unconsciousness when it serves to reinforce a sense of superiority or separation. You witness how spiritual communities often become breeding grounds for the most sophisticated forms of shadow projection, where the language of love and light is weaponized against anyone who dares to acknowledge the darkness that dwells within every human heart. The way power structures maintain themselves through projected darkness becomes startlingly clear. You see how societies organize themselves around the systematic disowning of their own shadow material, creating designated scapegoats who carry the collective darkness so that the majority can maintain their illusion of innocence. Nations demonize other nations, religions condemn other religions, and political movements define themselves in opposition to the evil they perceive in their opponent's soul, while remaining blind to the identical dynamics operating within their own borders. Don't you recognize the unconscious agreements that allow injustice to flourish unchallenged? How good people participate in harmful systems by refusing to acknowledge their complicity. How the collective shadow operates through institutional structures that appear legitimate on the surface, while perpetuating suffering in hidden ways. The shadow of the helper who needs others to remain helpless. The shadow of the teacher who requires students to stay ignorant. The shadow of the healer who profits from others' pain. These patterns become visible everywhere once you develop eyes to see them. This recognition is not cynicism, but clarity, not judgment, but discernment, born from the hard-won understanding that shadow work is not about eliminating darkness, but about bringing it into conscious relationship. You understand that the shadow is not evil, but unconscious, not demonic, but disowned, not something to be destroyed, but something to be integrated through the courageous act of acknowledgement and acceptance. The capacity to hold both light and shadow without splitting into simplistic good and evil thinking becomes a marker of psychological maturity and spiritual depth. You learn to recognize the shadow in yourself before seeking it in others, to take responsibility for your own projections before pointing out the projections of those around you. This is the beginning of true compassion, the recognition that we are all capable of both great beauty and terrible destruction, that the same human heart that can create poetry and music can also harbor hatred and violence. In learning to befriend your own shadow, you develop the capacity to see others with the same complex honesty, either idealizing them as perfect beings of light, nor demonizing them as irredeemable forces of darkness, but recognizing them as fellow travelers, struggling with the same fundamental human challenge of integrating all aspects of their nature into a coherent whole. This shadow work becomes a form of service to the collective healing. For every individual who reclaims their own projected darkness, reduces the amount of unconscious material circulating in the collective field. The scaffolding of your old belief systems begins to crumble, not through violent destruction, but through a gentle transcendence that renders them unnecessary rather than wrong. What once seemed like absolute truths, those fundamental certainties upon which you built your understanding of reality, purpose, and identity, now reveal themselves as provisional waypoints on an infinite journey of understanding, useful for their time, but ultimately too small to contain the expanding universe of your awareness. This dissolution occurs with the same inexorable patience that water demonstrates when reshaping stone. Drop by drop, your convictions soften and reshape themselves. The rigid categories that once organized your world, good and evil, right and wrong, sacred and profane, begin to blur at their edges, revealing themselves to be useful constructs rather than ultimate realities. You discover that truth is not a territory to be conquered, but an ocean to be explored, not a fortress to be defended, but a dance to be joined. You develop a profound comfort with uncertainty, finding solid ground in the very groundlessness that would have terrified your earlier self. This is the cultivation of what the poet Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. You learn to rest in not knowing as naturally as you once rested in full certainties, discovering that questions can be more nourishing than answers, that mystery is more expansive than explanation. The ego's desperate need for control begins to dissolve into the self's capacity for trust in the unfolding mystery of existence. Where once you demanded that life conform to your expectations and understanding, you now find yourself curious about what wants to emerge through you, what patterns are seeking expression, what new configurations of possibility are pressing against the boundaries of the known. This transformation requires tremendous courage, for it means releasing your grip on the life raft of certainty and learning to swim in the vast ocean of unknowing. It means allowing your most cherished beliefs to be composted in the soil of experience, trusting that whatever grows from their decay will be more alive, more authentic, more aligned with reality as it actually is, rather than as you wish it to be. You discover that beliefs held too tightly become prisons, while beliefs held lightly become doorways. The difference lies not in their content, but in your relationship to them, whether you possess them or they possess you, whether they serve your growth or constrain it, whether they connect you to the living truth of the present moment or bind you to the dead certainties of the past. In this dissolution of false certainties, you taste the freedom that comes from releasing the exhausting burden of having to know everything, of needing to have life figured out, of maintaining a consistent worldview in the face of ever-changing experience. You learn to trust the process of not knowing, to find peace in the spaces between certainties, to allow yourself to be surprised by life, rather than demanding that it confirm your preconceptions. This groundlessness becomes the most solid foundation you have ever known, not because it provides answers, but because it remains perpetually open to whatever truth wants to reveal itself next. Your emotional landscape undergoes a fundamental metamorphosis, like base metals being transformed into gold within the alchemical furnace of expanding consciousness. The feelings that once seemed like chaotic storms threatening to overwhelm your carefully constructed sense of self now reveal themselves as messengers from the depths of the unconscious, each carrying vital intelligence about your soul's evolution toward wholeness. This transformation begins with a radical shift in your relationship to emotional discomfort. Where once you might have immediately sought distraction, numbing, or quick resolution when difficult feelings arose. You now find yourself developing the capacity to sit with discomfort without immediately reaching for escape. You learn to hold space for paradox without collapsing into premature answers, to allow the full spectrum of human feeling to move through you, like weather patterns crossing an open sky. The nigredo, that blackening or decomposition phase known to alchemists as the necessary prelude to transformation, manifests in your emotional life as periods of intense dissolution. These are the dark nights of the soul when everything familiar seems to crumble, when old ways of feeling and responding prove inadequate to the complexity of your expanding awareness. Rather than signs of breakdown, you begin to recognize these episodes as sacred dissolutions, necessary clearings that make space for more authentic forms of emotional expression to emerge. Anger transforms from a force that possesses you into energy that moves through you, carrying information about boundaries that need strengthening or injustices that require addressing. Sadness ceases to be an enemy to be conquered and becomes a doorway to compassion, both for yourself and for the suffering that permeates all existence. Fear evolves from a paralyzing force into a messenger, alerting you to the edges of your growth, pointing toward the territories your soul is ready to explore. You discover that emotions are not personal possessions, but rather universal energies that flow through individual consciousness, like rivers flowing through particular landscapes. The grief you feel may contain not only your own losses, but the collective sorrow of humanity itself. The joy that bubbles up unexpectedly carries within it the celebration of life force itself, expressing through your particular nervous system, but belonging to the larger web of existence. This understanding brings tremendous relief from the burden of emotional ownership. You no longer need to carry every feeling as if it were entirely your own creation or responsibility. Instead, you become a conscious participant in the great emotional symphony of existence, allowing yourself to be played by forces far larger than your individual ego, while maintaining the discernment to know when to engage and when to simply witness. Each feeling becomes a thread in the tapestry of your becoming, woven together not through suppression or indulgence, but through conscious relationship. You learn the difference between feeling your emotions and being consumed by them, between honoring their wisdom and drowning in their intensity. This is the art of emotional alchemy, the transformation of raw feeling into refined consciousness, of unconscious reactivity into conscious response. The emotional chaos that once felt like evidence of your inadequacy reveals itself as the creative ferment from which psychological gold is refined. In learning to befriend your full emotional spectrum, you discover resources of resilience and wisdom you never knew you possessed. A profound alchemical transformation begins to occur in the relationship between your soul and solitude. What once felt like abandonment, the absence of others, the silence of phones that do not ring, the empty spaces where connection might have been now, reveals itself as sanctuary, as the sacred chamber where your authentic self can finally breathe without the constraining presence of external expectations and projections. Loneliness transforms from a feeling to be avoided at all costs into a doorway to be entered with reverence and curiosity. You discover that true solitude is not the absence of connection, but rather the presence of your authentic self, unfiltered by the complex negotiations required when relating to others. In this pristine aloneness, you encounter dimensions of your being that can only emerge when the social self steps aside. When the performer takes off their costume and makeup and stands naked before the mirror of consciousness, the crowd becomes a place of profound isolation. while solitude becomes a doorway to communion with the deeper currents of existence. This is perhaps the most confusing paradox of the awakening journey, how surrounded by people you can feel utterly alone, while in complete physical isolation, you can feel intimately connected to the living fabric of reality itself. In solitude, you begin to hear the whispers of the collective unconscious, the ancient voices that speak through symbol and dream, the eternal wisdom that flows beneath the chattering surface of ordinary consciousness. This is the sacred paradox of individuation that Jung understood so deeply. The more fully you become yourself authentically, courageously, without compromise, the more connected you feel to the universal patterns that govern all existence. Yet simultaneously, the more separate you appear from the collective trance that binds most people in familiar patterns of unconscious living. Your growing authenticity creates distance from those who remain identified with their social roles and personas, even as it connects you more intimately with the archetypal forces that move through all human experience. The wound of a life becomes a sacred opening through which wisdom enters your life, like the Fisher King in Arthurian legend, whose wound becomes the source of his deepest teaching. Your capacity to be alone becomes the foundation of your capacity to truly meet others. For only when you have learned to be comfortable in your own company can you offer genuine presence to another person rather than the needy projection of your own unfulfilled desires for connection. In the sanctuary of solitude, you begin to distinguish between the loneliness that arises from disconnection from others and the aloneness that emerges from deep connection with your essential self. The former is a wound that seeks healing through external means. The latter is a wholeness that requires no completion from outside sources. This distinction marks a crucial threshold in psychological development, the moment when relationship becomes a choice rather than a compulsion, when you can offer love from fullness rather than seeking it from emptiness. Your solitude becomes a gift not only to yourself but to the world. For a person who has learned to be authentically alone can meet others from a place of genuine freedom rather than unconscious need. The hermit's lantern illuminates not just the path for the seeker, but also shows others what it means to find home within oneself. Something profound shifts in your relationship with time itself, not the mechanical tick of clocks or the relentless march of calendar days, but the living pulse of your inner chronometer. Your internal rhythm begins to diverge from the frantic tempo of mass consciousness, like a musician finding their own beat in the midst of a discordant orchestra, while others rush through their days in habitual patterns, driven by the external demands of productivity and social expectation. You find yourself moving to the cadence of a different drummer, one whose rhythm echoes from the depths of the collective unconscious itself. This shift manifests first as a growing discomfort with the artificial urgency that characterizes modern life. The constant pressure to hurry, to achieve, to consume experiences at breakneck speed begins to feel not just unnecessary but actively harmful to your soul's natural unfolding. You discover that true transformation cannot be rushed, that consciousness expands according to its own organic timeline, like a flower that cannot be forced to bloom before its season has arrived. Synchronicities begin to multiply around you like breadcrumbs scattered along a forest path, each meaningful coincidence serving as a signpost pointing deeper into the mystery of your own becoming. What others dismiss as mere chance, you begin to recognize as the subtle orchestration of forces beyond ordinary perception. The number sequences that catch your attention, the conversations overheard at precisely the right moment, the books that fall off shelves just when you need their wisdom, these cease to be random occurrences and reveal themselves as part of an intricate web of meaning that connects all things. Time becomes elastic in your experience, pregnant with significance in ways that clock time could never measure. Minutes spent in deep contemplation feel more substantial than hours passed in mindless activity. A single moment of genuine insight carries more weight than years of accumulated information. You learn to read the symbolic language through which the psyche communicates, recognizing that the soul speaks not in linear narratives, but in the circular, mythic patterns that Jung called the eternal recurrence of archetypal themes. This is the activation of what the alchemists understood as the opus contra naturam, the work against nature that transforms base consciousness into golden awareness. You begin to operate according to kairos rather than chronos, sacred time rather than mechanical time, allowing yourself to be guided by the natural rhythms of expansion and contraction, activity and rest, speaking and silence that govern all. Living systems, your days reorganize themselves around these deeper pulses. You find yourself waking without alarm clocks, eating when genuinely hungry, rather than at prescribed mealtimes, engaging in creative work when inspiration strikes rather than according to arbitrary schedules. This is not laziness or lack of discipline, but rather attunement to a more fundamental order, the organic intelligence that orchestrates the seasons, the tides, the cycles of growth and decay that govern all life. Others may perceive your new relationship with time as impractical or irresponsible, not understanding that you have begun to align yourself with forces far more reliable than human scheduling. You discover that when you move in harmony with your inner timing, external synchronicities multiply, doors open at precisely the right moments, and resources appear exactly when needed. In this quickening of inner time, you taste the eternal dimension that exists within each moment. The timeless awareness that watches the drama of temporal existence unfold, without being caught in its urgencies and anxieties. The veil lifts, and with it comes a gift that feels more like a curse to terrible grace of clear sight. You begin to see through the elaborate theatrical productions that masquerade as authentic human interaction, witnessing the unconscious dramas playing out in every relationship, every social gathering, every public discourse. What once appeared as normal human behavior now reveals itself as an intricate dance of shadow projections, where people relate not to each other, but to the disowned aspects of themselves that they perceive in others. This clarity cuts like a double-edged sword through the comfortable numbness that once protected you from the full weight of collective unconsciousness. You watch friends and family members repeat destructive patterns with the mechanical precision of clockwork, seemingly unable to see the obvious connections between their choices and their suffering. You witness the unconscious agreements that maintain systemic dysfunction, how communities collude in their own limitation, how societies perpetuate cycles of harm through willful blindness to their own shadow material. The burden of seeing clearly extends beyond personal relationships into the broader tapestry of human civilization. You perceive how entire cultures organize themselves around the projection of their collective shadow onto designated others, how nations maintain their sense of righteousness by demonizing external enemies while remaining blind to the darkness within their own borders. You see how religious and spiritual communities often become the very thing they claim to oppose, wielding their supposed enlightenment as a weapon against those they deem less evolved. This is not the cynical disillusionment of one who has given up on humanity, but rather the painful clarity of one who loves humanity enough to see it truly. Your heart breaks open repeatedly as you witness the unnecessary suffering that arises from unconsciousness, the way people wound each other while believing they are protecting themselves, the way they create the very problems they spend their lives trying to solve, the way they search frantically outside themselves for what can only be found within. The hermit archetype begins to stir within you, not from misanthropy, but from the sacred loneliness of one who has glimpsed the truth. Behind the collective mask, you find yourself increasingly unable to participate in the shared delusions that bind communities together in their familiar patterns of sleep and dreaming. Social gatherings become exhausting exercises in conscious restraint as you bite your tongue to avoid speaking truths that would be received as judgment or attack. Yet this isolation serves a deeper purpose in the economy of the soul. Like the hermit in the tarot, you carry a lantern whose light can only shine authentically when you have withdrawn from the blinding glare of collective unconsciousness. Your solitude becomes a laboratory for truth, a space where authentic seeing can develop without the distorting influence of group dynamics and social pressure. The clarity that isolates you from the unconscious masses also connects you to something far more profound, the deeper currents of existence that flow beneath the surface drama of human affairs. You begin to perceive the archetypal patterns that govern human behavior, the mythic structures that repeat themselves across cultures and centuries, the eternal themes that play out in the theater of individual and collective life. This recognition brings both sorrow and liberation. Sorrow for the suffering that unconsciousness creates. Liberation in the understanding that this suffering is not ultimate reality, but rather a kind of collective trance from which awakening is possible. Your clear sight becomes a form of service, a way of holding space for truth in a world that often prefers comfortable lies to uncomfortable realities. In time, you may discover that the burden of clear sight transforms into the blessing of compassionate. Witness the capacity to see the full spectrum of human experience without losing your center, to hold both the darkness and the light without collapsing into despair or spiritual bypassing. The awakening soul discovers a peculiar affliction. Words begin to feel like empty vessels, hollow containers that can no longer hold the depth and complexity of what you now perceive. Language itself becomes a prison, its walls too narrow to accommodate the vastness that consciousness has revealed to you. You sit in conversations that once engaged you, watching as familiar phrases are exchanged like worn coins, their value diminished through endless repetition, their meaning eroded by unconscious use. There is a profound loneliness that emerges when you begin to hear the mechanical nature of most human discourse, the same stories recycled endlessly, the same complaints wrapped in different packaging, the same spiritual bypassing disguised as wisdom. You listen to friends speak with passionate conviction about matters that seem to you like shadows dancing on the wall of Plato's cave, and you feel the weight of unspoken truths pressing against your chest like stones. Your tongue grows heavy with the knowledge you cannot easily share, for you have begun to understand that the language of the awakening soul cannot be translated into the dialect of sleep without losing its essential essence. What Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious bridge between conscious and unconscious realms, renders ordinary discourse insufficient to carry the freight of your expanding awareness. You find yourself reaching for words that do not exist, grasping for expressions that could convey the texture of your inner experience, only to watch them dissolve before they reach your lips. This is not intellectual snobbery or spiritual arrogance, though it may be mistaken for such by those who do not understand the nature of this particular isolation. It is rather the natural consequence of depth meeting surface, of the infinite attempting to express itself through the finite. You have begun to taste the wordless wisdom that flows beneath the chatter of everyday consciousness. And having tasted it, you find the superficial exchanges of social interaction increasingly difficult to swallow. In group conversations, you become acutely aware of the unconscious agreements that govern human interaction, the unspoken rules that keep discourse safely contained within acceptable boundaries, the collective resistance to anything that might disturb the comfortable numbness of routine exchange. You see how conversations function as mutual reassurance rituals, where participants take turns confirming each other's existing beliefs rather than exploring new territories of understanding. Gradually, you become fluent in a different kind of communication, the language of silence, the eloquence of pause, the poetry of what remains unspoken. You learn to find communion not in the exchange of words, but in the spaces between them, in the quality of presence that can be shared without the mediation of language. A glance becomes more meaningful than a paragraph. A moment of shared silence carries more truth than hours of discussion. You discover that there are others who speak this wordless language, fellow travelers on the path of consciousness, who recognize each other, not by what they say, but by what they do not need to say. With them, you experience the relief of authentic communication, the joy of being understood at levels deeper than vocabulary can reach. These encounters become sacred oases in the desert of superficial exchange. Yet even this recognition brings its own challenges. For you must learn to navigate a world where most communication occurs at frequencies you are gradually tuning away from, where your natural response to silence, contemplation, depth is often interpreted as disengagement or judgment. You must develop the capacity to translate your inner knowing into language that can be received without triggering defensive reactions, to speak truth in ways that invite rather than alienate. This is the art of conscious communication, to honor both the depth of your own awareness and the journey of others who may not yet be ready to venture into the wordless territories you have begun to explore. It requires a delicate balance between authenticity and compassion, between truth-telling and meeting people where they are. In time, you may discover that your growing fluency in the language of silence actually enhances your capacity for meaningful speech. Words, when they do come, carry more weight precisely because they are not used carelessly. Your communications become more concentrated, more essential, distilled down to their most potent essence, like medicine prepared by a careful alchemist.